Good afternoon, Emily Matesic, and greetings from Galashiels in Scotland. Now I'm sure that just as I was baffled by the name of Manitowoc 4 years ago, you are equally bemused as to where on earth is Galashiels. It is 30 miles south of Edinburgh, near the border with England. I was first alerted to making a murderer by my youngest daughter, who told me about a Netflix documentary called Making a Murderer. Now, some people would seem to think that you, as a journalist, are on the side of Steven Avery being guilty. I don't. I think, personally, that you are the inquisiting voice of some people who believe that Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey are guilty, but I'm not convinced that you necessarily think that they are guilty. One of my favourite lines of yours from Making a Murderer is when you ask Mike Holbach within the Manitowoc County Court case. Mike Holbach is talking about the fact that in the case of Brendan Dassey, just pop the video into the video player and there's the case against Brendan Dassey. And quite rightly, you ask him, have you seen it yet? Have you watched it yourself, Mike? He says no. And the look on your face is absolutely brilliant. It reminds us of Scott Walker, who did the same thing when asked, have you watched Making a Murderer? No. When they asked Robert Herman, have you watched Making a Murderer? No. And yet they were quite happy to criticise it without having even seen it. In the same way that Mike Holbach is quite happy to say that the confession proves everything when he himself has not actually watched the video. So as I say, I don't buy into this argument that there are journalists in this case that are on the side of guilty or innocent. So anyway, let's move on. Another of the, I think one of the most stunning lines from Making a Murderer is when Mike Holbach, being interviewed whilst Teresa is still only a missing person, refers to the grieving process. Now, I'm sure that you are more than familiar with that line from Mike Holbach. I wonder what your reaction to that line was, and the line, what the reaction of other people within the journalism community was to that particular line. From my own personal point of view, I find it strange on three different levels. First of all, family members are the last ones to ever accept that any harm has come to a loved family member. So for him to be grieving already is very strange. The fact that he's grieving at all means that he knows of the demise of Teresa Holbach, or at least it would appear to be so. But what is most incredulous is when he says that the grieving process could last days. This, of course, has caused a lot of speculation about whether Teresa Holbach did meet her demise or not, and that she might yet still be alive and is simply being hidden. I would really like to know your opinion on the comments by Mike Holbach, and if you're aware of any of the journalists covering what he actually said then. The reason I ask this is because back in Cambridgeshire in 2003, we had a particularly appalling case where Ian Huntley murdered two little girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. Whilst they were missing persons, and the investigation had been ongoing for a long time, trying to discover what had happened to these girls. Eventually, Maxine Carr let slip in an interview with a Sky reporter where she referred to the girls, well, she referred to Holly Wells, who had been a student in her class up until the summer holidays. She referred to her twice as she was a nice girl, using the past tense. The journalists immediately picked up on that. The next day, both Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr were arrested, and this led to the discovering of what had happened to them. So as I say, I would be really interested to know if Mike Holbrook was ever questioned by you or other journalists about this statement. As I say, I have heard people suggest that you are on the side of Stephen Avery being guilty. To an extent, I can understand why. Behind me, as you can see, is the state flag, but it's the Charlie Barrens Manitowoc Minute state flag, and just over my shoulder here is a postcard, a picture that Charlie very kindly sent me. It says, it comments about me playing the accordion and finishes with his favourite line of "Go Packers," and I won't repeat the rest. In a message with him, I asked him about his thoughts on making a murderer. He said, "I don't have a great read on that, to be honest. It seems many in Manitowoc don't like how it paints the town the same. Others blame the police. I think most agree the nephew didn't have anything to do with it." So anyway, moving back to an interesting video that I watched, well, listened to just a wee while back on the Millbilly channel. We've got a series of phone calls that Stephen Avery made from his jail cell. One of them, which I've listened to a couple of times, was to yourself. And it struck me, you sound incredulous that Stephen Avery doesn't just admit guilt to you over the phone. And, of course, we hear on Making a Murderer 2, we hear you on the court step, on the steps outside the court, ask Kathleen Zellner the important question: what if the test results end up proving that Stephen Avery is guilty? And of course, Kathleen Zellner replies, well, that is the risk that anybody I represent takes. If I find that they're guilty, I will not be hiding that information, I will be making that public. So I just wondered what your thoughts are now that we've had a certain amount of testing done. We've discovered that there is 20 times more of Stephen Avery's DNA on that key than should be. And yet, even more bizarrely, there's 90 times more DNA on the bonnet catch swab. And of course, no other items within the engine compartment were ever swabbed. Were they trying to avoid collecting evidence to prove that their narrative is false? We've since learnt that a bonfire cannot fully cremate a body down to just 40% of its bones. It is impossible for that bonfire to have created those cremains. And of course we have a bullet fragment that supposedly went through Teresa's head, but with no bone in it, but wood. And of course, we've got blood experts that have shown how impossible it would be for the blood to be left in the RAV4 in just a few and half a dozen particular places, and the fact that we've got some dried blood flakes. Who bleeds blood flakes? As I say, I'll go back to that line. I think that you, I admire you greatly. I think you're a really good journalist. I like the fact that you're asking that question of Mike Holbrook. Have you watched the video? And the look on your face, you can tell you are not impressed by Mike Holbrook. And I can assure you, none of us are either. particularly with those comments. But it just seems that in comparison with the Soham murders, when a statement so similar to Mike Holbach's leads to the case being busted wide open, why are we, and now 14 years later, we still haven't had justice for Teresa, Stephen or Brendan? Any thoughts that you might have, I would be very much delighted to hear from you about, and take care. Bye for now.